The times. Yeah, me too. Dogs and carpet. I had dogs and pills. Shove them down the throat. Just kind of crazy. Fabulous. I like the bigger print. Well, good morning. I will get us started. Welcome to this Thursday morning Geriatric Grand Rounds. Welcome to those of you in the room and also on Zoom. We are really excited about our annual drug update today by Dr. Fixen and Dr. Linnebur. So we will also have grand rounds next on May 2nd. That will be our annual geriatrics highlights. So come for that for Dr. Krenke, Dr. Nearing, Dr. Wary, Dr. Dairagi. And that's a teaser. You won't even know what the topics are, so you'll have to come to see what will be highlighted. We also have Journal Club on May 9th in May. Dr. Clark and Dr. Gilhooly, that will be on Zoom. Please fill out the evaluations when you get them, either online or in person. And you'll also be able to view this on YouTube if you want to circle back to some of the medication updates. So Dr. Fixen is Associate Professor here at the University of Colorado Skaggs School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. She's also a clinical pharmacist at Seniors Clinic. Dr. Linnebur is a professor also at the School of Pharmacy, also a pharmacist at Seniors Clinic. Thank you so much for this presentation today. Thank you. Thank you, Hillary. Can you guys hear us on Zoom? Is that good? Hopefully.
Yes.
All right. Oh, thank you. So today we're going to talk about new drug and device update. And so this year we added device because Dr. Fixen is going to talk about a new CGM that's over the counter. So we wanted to add device. As per usual, we will be discussing anything that we felt like was really relevant to older adults. So some years there are more drugs than others. This year, I think we have 4 different main topics that we'll be discussing. And when we do discuss medications, we want to make sure that we try to discuss the side effects and pharmacokinetics or pertinent drug-drug interactions that relate to that drug in the use of older adults. And then we try to discuss what kind of patient might fit that criteria. So our time frame for this presentation is limited to January 2023 through February 2024, although I do have a medication that I'm presenting today that is not FDA approved. It got punted. So I'll go over that in a second. So I'll be discussing donanemab and then brexpiprazole, and then Dr. Fixen will be moving on to our COVID-19 medication and the OTC continuous glucose monitor. And we will take questions at the end. And Hillary, are you monitoring chat? Jessica is. Okay, awesome. Thank you. So let's start with donanemab. The reason that donanemab does not have a brand name here is because it did not get FDA approved on schedule. It was originally set for March 12th and got punted, to which I think might be May. So I just want to give a quick background on donanemab is a monoclonal antibody for Alzheimer's disease. And as you know, we had the first drug FDA approved for Alzheimer's disease in 20 years. That was in June of 2021, and it was aducanumab or Aduhelm. I have the balloon popping up on the right-hand side because we were so excited to actually have a new medication for Alzheimer's disease. But that balloon popped in February of 2020, well, much earlier than February of 2024, but aducanumab was FDA approved in a limited access originally, and due to some of the major side effects plus the controversial approval and the way that aducanumab was approved by the FDA, it just wasn't utilized, and Biogen discontinued marketing in February. So not actually a huge issue because we weren't using aducanumab in clinical practice. The second drug that's in this drug class,
lecanemab, or Leqembi, was FDA approved for a full FDA approval in July of 2023, and that drug is currently going to be accessible through UC Health here in April. So we do have lecanemab on the market in the United States. It is available for use. It is covered by Medicare Part B for mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia. And your neurology is going to be the service that is initially able to order it. There is about a 6-month wait at UC Health currently for this, and the first patient will start to be seen late April by neurology. So we have had big advancements in the last couple of years for Alzheimer's disease, the latest of which is donanemab. So all 3 of these agents, aducanumab, lecanemab, and donanemab, they end in mab. So if you've been, looking at drugs over the last maybe 10, 15 years, if it ends in mab, that means monoclonal antibody. And these are monoclonal antibodies that will bind up amyloid, beta amyloid protein. So when the picture on here is a more patient-friendly graphic, but it describes how the patient will get an IV medication. That IV medication is the monoclonal antibody. It goes to the brain, it binds up the beta amyloid, and then your body's natural immune system will clear that bound beta amyloid from the brain. And this is one of the main pathophysiologies that we believe causes Alzheimer's disease. What we know, though, is it's very complex, and there are likely other pathophysiologies involved, not just beta amyloid. But when patients are in early stages of dementia or in mild cognitive impairment, that's the time to target the beta amyloid in the brain, because once that beta amyloid has caused all the damage and there are very high levels of protein tau and neurofibrillary tangles, then it's too late to affect that pathophysiologic process. So if we could really identify these beta amyloid particles building up before patients had symptoms, that would be ideal. But we don't really have adequate ways to detect that we could use at a population level. So right now, for example, we're not doing in clinical practice serum levels of protein tau or serum levels of beta amyloid, but we just are not doing that in clinical practice. So I think in the next 20 years, we'll have even more knowledge of hopefully of this disease process, since many of us in this room have been practicing for already 20 years. And, we might be in the group that's getting these drugs. I hope not, but maybe. So donanemab, like I mentioned, was supposed to be approved in March. It was punted by the FDA. I read somewhere in May, although now I can't actually find a real PDUFA date. But Lilly had expected it to get a full FDA approval in March, I did too. The data are pretty positive, but what happened was, I guess the FDA wanted an advisory panel, an additional independent advisory panel to look over some of the concerns they had, one of which was some deaths in the donanemab trial. There were 3 deaths in the donanemab group, none of which were in patients that you would sort of expect to be more likely to have the ARIA adverse events. And I'll go into that in a little bit. But they also, I guess, wanted to look at the more unique trial design. So I'm going to kind of compare and contrast a little bit the lecanemab data with the donanemab data so you can kind of understand where they're coming from. Donanemab is an IV medication. They're all IV. And the dosing is different for all of them. Donanemab is dosed at 700 milligrams IV monthly for 3 months. That's not an effective dose. Then that dose is increased to the effective dose, which is double that, 1,400 milligrams monthly thereafter. The unique trial design in this study, and I'm really focusing on the Trailblazer 2 trial, which is the study that had clinical outcomes for dementia, not just clearing the amyloid from the brain. So in that study, if the patients had beta amyloid clearance at 24 weeks and it was significant, then they could be switched to placebo. I suspect that's just to reduce adverse drug events. But because patients, in the other trials, aducanumab, lecanemab were on the drug continuously, they didn't end up on placebo if they had a benefit. This trial design is a little bit different. Also, interestingly, in the 3 patients who died in the donanemab arm, they were past the 4-week point when they started to have their ARIA symptoms. And the trial design originally only had a 4-week MRI done in Japan. And then they changed the protocol midway through and added that 4-week MRI. So if you remember with lecanemab and with aducanumab, the patients are diagnosed with a PET scan and a CSF test. They actually didn't do a CSF test with the donanemab trial, so they just did the PET scan. So a little bit less invasive. But when patients were started on the medication, they had to have a baseline MRI to look in their brain for potential bleeding or edema, just to have a baseline expectation for what that pathophysiologic process was before the drug. And then the MRI is on the regular basis is to reassess for ARIA side effects. So ARIA side effects would be the amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, typically microhemorrhages, hemosiderin deposit, and then edema. And with donanemab, they weren't doing this until the 12-week mark. So originally, except in Japan, it was at 12, 24, 52, and 72 weeks. And then those 3 patients that died were past that 4-week mark. So then they moved to the protocol. Everyone had a 4-week MRI. And then if the patients have radiographically observed ARIA, depending on the severity of that, how many areas of the brain there are, hemosiderin deposits or microhemorrhages, then the medication would be adjusted. Most of the time, the medication would be held. So the phase 3 study, the Trailblazer-ALZ 2, similar to lecanemab, it's an 18-month study. It was published in JAMA in 2023. And this particular study was pretty similar in terms of like who was included, who could be included compared to lecanemab, but the patients that were included looked a little bit different. As I mentioned, they have to have MCI or mild dementia, and that's an expectation because the medication is not going to be effective later in the stages of Alzheimer's disease. And they did have to have PET evidence of amyloid and tau, but no CSF testing, so a little bit, again, less invasive from that perspective. The primary endpoints of the Trailblazer A2 were slightly different from the lecanemab data. So their primary endpoint, Lilly used the Integrated Alzheimer's Disease Rating Scale, or IADRS. This is a validated scale that contains 2 other sections, which were in their secondary endpoints. And then they had another secondary endpoint, which was the CDR-SB, Clinical Dementia Rating Scale Sum of Boxes, which was the primary endpoint of the lecanemab study. As with all these studies, they also looked at amyloid burden in the brain. So about the same number of patients were included in this study compared to lecanemab. The mean age was 73 years, 57% were women. One thing that is different here is with donanemab, the trial was a little bit less diverse than with lecanemab. So for example, they only had 6 Black patients. In the lecanemab trial, they had 44 Black patients. So still small numbers, but less diverse in the donanemab trial. They also were more progressed in their dementia. So while only 16% had MCI in this study, about 60% had MCI in the lecanemab trial. So these patients were more progressed in their dementia, more likely to be in the mild dementia category versus MCI. So that's something to consider. They did look at how how developed the tau was. So for example, if someone had high severity or high levels of tau, then they may be more progressed. And in this study, 68% were in the low to medium group of tau. They also had 17% who were ApoE homozygotes, 54% who were heterozygotes. So as you know, ApoE4 homozygotes are the highest risk for ARIA side effects. And in the 3 patients who died, none of them were ApoE4 homozygotes. 2 of them were heterozygotes, 1 had no ApoE4, so they were a 3 or a 2 carrier. And lecanemab that study had a little bit in terms of like they had to be stable on their anticoagulant, antiplatelet. This study had no exclusion criteria related to anticoagulants. The 3 who died were not on anticoagulants or antiplatelets. So again, not in the group that you might consider high risk for those adverse events. So looking at the outcomes, before you look at the numbers, because there's a lot on the slide, everything was positive, quote, positive for donanemab versus placebo, but every single outcome, patients declined. They just declined less with donanemab versus placebo. So everyone's declining, but less decline. And this is over 18 months. So the primary outcome is the I-ADRS. This is a composite outcome of the ADAS-Cog13 scale, which is 0 to 85, and the ADCS-I-ADL scale, which is 0 to 59. So total for the primary outcome of 0 to 144 points. The baseline was 104 out of 144. Lower on that scale is worse. So again, they're more in that mild-ish category. And you can see that the change with donanemab was minus 10 points and the placebo minus 13 points. So minus is getting worse. So it's less worse with donanemab. And this is very similar to the lecanemab trial too. Everyone got worse, but less worse with lecanemab. Yes. So the least squares mean difference was 3 points on a 144 point scale, but that's statistically significant. And if you know dementia data, everything mostly has been statistically significant, all the drugs that have been FDA approved. Memantine or Namenda actually has some data where they couldn't even show statistical significance in mild dementia, so that's why it's not approved for that category of dementia. But everything else, you know, clinical significance is different than statistical. On the CDR-SB, which was the primary outcome of the lecanemab data, that's a 0 to 18 point scale. Their baseline was 3.9, and so they were 1 point worse than at baseline than the lecanemab patients. And their change was, so again, higher is worse. So 1.72 with donanemab versus 2.42 with placebo. Least square mean difference minus 0.7. Just to put it into perspective, and I'm not really comparing apples to apples here because the stats are different, but the change with lecanemab was minus 0.45. This is minus 0.7. So a 0.5 swing on the CDR-SB is mild to moderate on one of the categories. So some people might think that's a clinically significant difference, but again, the statistical outcomes or statistical tests were different. So they didn't use least square means in the lecanemab trial. Amyloid plaque reduction was good compared to placebo. Placebo had like no amyloid plaque reduction. You can see minus 87 versus 0.67 centiloids. And then you can see at the 24-week point where they did potentially send people over to placebo, about 30% on donanemab had cleared their amyloid by 24 weeks. Side effect wise, donanemab is a little different than lecanemab. So 89% had a side effect. That's why we know older adults, they get, you know, symptoms in clinical trials and you don't really blame it on the drug, but you have to report it as a side effect. So that's normal to have 89% get a side effect. Because if you just got a cold in the trial, it counts as a side effect. But very low discontinuation rate due to side effects, so only 8% here. Lecanemab has a higher infusion-related reaction, so only 8.7% had an infusion-related reaction with donanemab, but the ARIA side effects were at a higher rate. So the microhemorrhage hemosiderin deposit, 19.7% in the donanemab group, and 24% had edema, so the ARIA-E. 14% had a headache, and 13% fell. The headache part is what's tough because you don't know if a headache is from something else or is it from the drug. And unfortunately, a headache could be a symptom of the ARIA. So then you kind of have to that's one of the clinical practice things that we have to consider is like, what do we do about headaches? As with lecanemab, donanemab will have a black box warning. So it's not FDA approved, but it's going to have this black box warning. The black box warning is a class warning, and this shows that patients who are ApoE4 homozygotes, so have two alleles of the ApoE4, they're going to be at higher risk of ARIA side effects. So for example, the VA has lecanemab on the national formulary. You cannot get it if you're ApoE4. So you do have to have genetic testing done before you can get the drug. And depending on your genetic testing, and you have to have genetic counseling available, patients may or may not be eligible or be a good candidate for the monoclonal antibodies. So I just wanted to give a quick show of some of these main differences. Aducanumab, as you know, is not on the market anymore, but you can see aducanumab had even higher ARIA rates than donanemab. So 30-some% of patients had ARIA-H, ARIA-E, and it took a long time to become effective. So patients were titrated up. It took 7 months to get to that effective dose. It just as with first drugs coming to the market in a drug class, they're often not ideal. Lecanemab, which is what we have on the market, it's covered by the Medicare Part B and the VA. That is a 10 milligram per kilogram IV infusion every 2 weeks, but you don't have to titrate. So it starts at the effective dose. Donanemab's giving monthly, so less infusions, but you do have to titrate to get to an effective dose. You can kind of see the ARIA side effects here between the two, a little bit less with lecanemab, but more infusion-related reactions. So we will be at UC Health offering medications like, unfortunately, diphenhydramine or other antihistamines, corticosteroids, acetaminophen, those kind of things for patients who have infusion-related reactions. And just as a reminder, for lecanemab, which is currently covered by Medicare Part B, it is about $26,000 a year. Medicare Part B does have a deductible, so patients have to pay that annually. Their supplement does not pay the deductible. It was $240 in 2023. So it's not substantial, but they do have that 20% copay once they've met their deductible. And if they have a supplement, that does pay that 20% copay. So it is something that could be affordable for patients who have a supplement. Probably not as affordable for those who don't. We don't really know about the Advantage plans yet, what will happen. All right, I'm going to move on to Rexulti or brexpiprazole. If you guys have questions, we can get to those at the end. Thank you. So Rexulti is actually FDA approved. It's been FDA approved for quite some time for schizophrenia, depression, but it was approved in May for agitation associated with dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. So this is the only antipsychotic or any medication that's FDA approved for Alzheimer's symptoms that are neuropsychiatric. So I want to make it clear, it's not approved for psychosis. No antipsychotics are approved for psychosis related to dementia. So it's only approved for agitation, and I have a slide on what that means. So if you look at the package insert, it says the mechanism for dementia is unknown. And this is almost all the psych drugs now just say, we don't know how they work. But we do know a little bit about how this drug works. And brexpiprazole is a sort of modified version of aripiprazole. Aripiprazole had a little bit more akathisia, and so the manufacturer wanted to reduce the amount of akathisia, so they modified the chemical structure a little bit, and brexpiprazole does have a little bit less akathisia. So it is thought because the mechanism is pretty similar, but it's a partial agonist at D2 and a little bit less active at D2 compared to aripiprazole. And then it is also a partial agonist at serotonin 5-HT1A, a little bit more so than aripiprazole, and then it has antagonist activity at 5-HT2A. So when we think about, and there's actually some alpha blockade as well. But when we think about agitation, the clinical trial, there are 2 clinical trials that got it FDA approved. I'm going to focus just on the one that was the correct dose. But what does agitation mean by the clinical trial? This is based on the Cohen-Mansfield Agitation Inventory. So patients in that trial had to have at least one of these symptoms here, behaviors occurring several times a week, or they could have 2 or more, 1 to 2 times a week, or 3 or more less than once a week. So hitting, kicking, scratching, grabbing, pushing, biting, hurting self or others, cursing or verbal aggression, spitting, tearing or destroying property, screaming, and throwing things. So this is what agitation means. This does not mean hallucinations. This does not mean delusions. This does not mean paranoia. Those are all the psychosis symptoms that this drug is not approved for. And I say that because it has a black box warning, just like all other antipsychotics that said it's not approved for psychosis of dementia, just like every other antipsychotic. The starting dose of brexpiprazole is not the effective dose. This is really important because this drug was studied at different doses and it's only effective at 2 milligram or higher. So that's really important because if we're going to use it, we need to dose it appropriately. Now, could a patient have benefit at 0.5? Maybe. But in clinical trials, it wasn't effective, no more than placebo. And in the United States part of these studies, there was a big placebo effect. So it is important to know the dosing. It does come in a dose pack. So if you go into Epic, you can order it at 0.5 for a week and 1 milligram for a week. That's the first dose pack. And then you can order the 2 milligram on its own. It also comes in a 3 milligram, but you don't have to go to the 3 milligram. The benefits are fairly similar between 2 and 3 milligram. The max dose of patients have kidney dysfunction is 2 milligram a day, and it's pretty darn expensive. $1,500 cash price for 30 days. So if it is covered because these medications are a protected class of medications. It's the only FDA approved one. So it's covered on every plan that I looked at, but with a prior authorization. So for example, if you go to TRICARE, you have to fill out a prior authorization. You have to say they have agitation associated with dementia. You have to say that they already failed non-pharmacologic therapy. You have to say that they need drug therapy and that you understand the risks of the drug as a provider in order to get it approved. It's not for PRN use. So sometimes we use antipsychotics PRN. It's not for PRN. It's only approved as a daily medication. The warnings are consistent with other antipsychotics. It does have the regular old black box warning related to increased mortality with dementia-related psychosis. So that is on every antipsychotic. Like similar other antipsychotics, it can cause neuroleptic malignant syndrome. That's pretty rare when you don't titrate the patient off of it. Tardive dyskinesia is side effect to most antipsychotics. Metabolic changes occur. That would be like glucose increases. There were patients in the study who converted to diabetes in theory, because of this drug. Also, triglycerides can go up. We also see weight gain, but less weight gain in this study. The patients didn't really have significant weight gain compared to like the depression trials. And then orthostatic hypotension and syncope from that alpha blockade. And then most of them can lower seizure threshold. There are some drug interactions with CYP450, 2D6, and 3A4 inhibitors and inducers. Side effect wise, this drug is pretty well tolerated. So I have the side effects listed here, but like they were low incident rates. So headache was the highest, 8 to 9%, but that was similar to placebo. And all drugs cause headache. So, and I say that in air quotes. But the main side effect that you'd expect would be somnolence or sedation and dizziness. And even that was only somnolence 3 to 4%, dizziness 3 to 5%. Insomnia is 4 to 5, but that was similar to placebo. So nasopharyngitis also occurs in almost all drugs in older patients, but it was different than placebo. And then UTIs were 3%. So really well tolerated, in my opinion. So the one trial that I'm going to go through is the trial where they actually had fixed doses. So patients were on 2 milligrams, 3 milligrams, or placebo. The other trial that got it FDA approved for agitation did not use a fixed dose, and so some patients were on 1 milligram, which was ineffective. This trial only included 345 patients, so really small. Mean age was 74. They were mostly white, but 30% Hispanic white. They had, they could have an MMSE 5 to 22, but most of them were in that 13 to 18 range, so moderate dementia. Most of them were on dementia meds, so most of them were on donepezil, and about 15 to 20% were on another psych med. Most of the time that was lorazepam. Wasn't always benzo, but most of the time lorazepam. And they could only be on lorazepam initially, and then they had to go off of the lorazepam. And 19% also had psychosis, so hallucinations, delusions, that kind of thing. When they looked, this study looked at the CMAI, the Cohen-Mansfield agitation score, as the primary outcome. And so that ranges from 29 to 203 points. And at baseline, they were in the 80 range. The change in the CMAI at 12 weeks was 22.6 points on that scale versus 17.3. With placebo, that was statistically different, for a difference of 5 points on that scale. You can see here again, statistically different doesn't always mean clinically significant, but they actually, I don't have all the data on here, but in the study, they actually break it down and show like who had at least a 20% improvement, who had a 30% improvement, who had a 40% improvement. And so I did include the 40% because that seems pretty significant to me. And they did have 23% of the patients in the brexpiprazole arm have a 40% or higher improvement. And then in the placebo, you can see there's still a placebo benefit, 14.7%. The patients, the clinicians, and everyone in the study were all blinded. So they didn't even blinded to the behaviors. So, but still there's a placebo effect. You can just see on the slide here, the CMAI total score and the CGI-S score. This is related to agitation. The reason I put this graph on here is just to see where the difference is between the two drug arms. So you can see that the difference between placebo didn't occur until about 6 weeks. So you titrate the patient up over 2 weeks, then they're on the full dose 2 milligram, but they had to be on that for another month to really see a difference between placebo. So it's important, if you are going to try this medication, to give them a full trial, which they need to at least wait 6 to 8 weeks for that. So where does Rexulti fit? It's the only FDA-approved medication for agitation associated with dementia. It's not approved for PRN use, so that's really important. It's not approved for psychosis. Again, that's off-label, like all other antipsychotics for dementia. It still has the same risks as the other antipsychotics. It doesn't have QT prolongation, which is good. It is pretty well tolerated. It may put patients in the donut hole. So the donut hole eventually is leaving. It's been eventually leaving for several years. I'm still here right now. So maybe next year it's gone. I don't know. But it could definitely, this drug could definitely put people in the donut hole. All right. Thank you so much, Danielle.
All right. Okay, so we're going to transition out of dementia and go into, we're first going to start off with reviewing PEMGARDA. So PEMGARDA was approved for emergency use authorization just last month, towards the middle of the month, for pre-exposure prophylaxis of COVID-19 in patients who have moderate to severe immunocompromise. So think of your patient who maybe they just recently underwent a stem cell transplant. It may be a patient who's on severely immunocompromising medications. There's a laundry list of patients who could potentially receive this infusion. It is a monoclonal antibody, so very similar, if you remember Evusheld when it was on the market back in 2022. They removed it, I think it was January of 2023, just because it wasn't targeting the most recent COVID-19 variant. And so PEMGARDA is kind of the new kid on the block that's currently targeting the most recent COVID-19 variant that we have. So the dose, it is a single infusion, 4,500 milligrams IV, and the infusion is said to be about 1 hour long. It should be available sometime later this month. So you may have patients ask about it, especially those who may have malignancies that they're being treated. And it should be covered under the Medicare Part B benefit for those patients. The dose should be repeated every 3 months. The great thing about a lot of our infusions is that they don't require any renal or hepatic dose adjustments. So that's great. But I think one important thing that will be a good discussion point with patients is that this is not for COVID-19 treatment. So we do have treatment options available like Paxlovid, Molnupiravir, Remdesivir. So this is for that pre-exposure prophylaxis. Specifically, the patients that I would think of would be those who were worried that they're not mounting a response to the COVID-19 vaccine. For those patients, so let's say we do have a patient that receives a COVID-19 vaccine, but then we know that they're going to undergo treatment for a malignancy. It is recommended to administer the infusion 2 weeks after that vaccine. So Canopy, that's the big study that, or not big, but that's the study that's ongoing that brought the emergency use authorization. So this study looked at 306 participants. It was an open label study in adults who had moderate to severe immune compromise. And what they measured for their primary endpoint was the serum virus neutralizing antibody titers at 28 days. And then they continue to measure those titers just to see at what point do we need to redose for patients to prevent COVID-19 infections. And so previous data from studies showed that a titer around 3,500 is that mark where you need to consider redosing patients. So the results of the Canopy study in these immunocompromised patients at 28 days, the titers were well above that 3,500 mark. And then around 90 days, you could see that the titers fell below that 3,500 mark. And so specifically when they were measuring the titers, they found that around 77 days, it was a median of 77 days where those titers remained above 3,500. And so that's where they came up with administer an infusion every 90 days. So then what about the safety results? I think this is always important when we're discussing infusions and, risk versus benefits with patients. The most, I would say, alarming results were just the infusion-related and hypersensitivity reactions. It did occur in just a small number of patients, so 20 patients or 7% with the first dose, and most of those were mild to moderate infusion-related reactions. There were 2 patients who had anaphylaxis and they were treated with diphenhydramine. And if the patient had anaphylaxis, they did not receive any more infusions. So then when they looked cumulatively of patients who received a first dose, maybe they tolerated okay, and then received a second dose, they had 2 more patients experience anaphylaxis, and one of those actually had to be hospitalized and they were treated with epinephrine, and it took them, I think they said around 48 hours before they became stable. So based on that information, it is recommended that whenever patients receive this infusion, they're monitored during the infusion and then 2 hours afterwards. So I think from, a patient infusion standpoint and thinking about the patient going to the infusion center to receive this, it's probably going to be a half-day process, just in terms of filling out the paperwork, receiving the 1-hour infusion, and then monitoring for at least 2 hours after that infusion. So based on the safety information, as you can imagine, if a patient has anaphylaxis, they should not receive that infusion. Again, looking out for those hypersensitivity related reactions during and up to 24 hours after the infusion. And some of those are like flu-like symptoms. Some patients had fevers, chills, headaches. And so just making sure that patients are aware of, if they do have some of those infusions, they can treat with over-the-counter medications like acetaminophen to see if that's helpful for those patients, like we do with some of our other infusion-related medications. Okay, so for PEMGARDA, I want to get a show of hands of who thinks that they would recommend PEMGARDA for a patient who has COPD, HFrEF, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes. Okay, good, no hands. What about a patient that received a stem cell transplant? Okay, great. A patient who received prednisone for a gout flare. Okay, no, yeah. So specifically with PEMGARDA, if a patient is on a high dose of prednisone, so a 20 milligram or greater equivalent for more than 2 weeks, that potentially could be a patient that would benefit from PEMGARDA. What about a patient receiving infliximab for rheumatoid arthritis? Yeah, so that could be, that medication can cause immunosuppression. So potentially that would be one where, I would definitely weigh the risk and discuss with the patient some of those hypersensitivity reactions and see what the concern is. So I know that you may be thinking, I haven't heard too much about COVID-related deaths. It's not on the news as much as it was. And I did check the data last week from the CDC, and it appears that there's a little more than 700,000 patients in the U.S. hospitalized for COVID-19 related infections, and then the death rate is around 1%. So of those patients, it's not as high as it was in like 2020, 2021, or even 2022. But this would potentially be the group of patients who could have a COVID-19 related death. Okay, so I wanted just to touch on that one because we're going to spend a lot more time on Stello. So I remember it because it sounds like Jello. Stello, which is our first FDA-approved over-the-counter continuous glucose monitor. And when I first saw this, I was like, oh, okay, this is, interesting. This will be great for, patients who just maybe not just our older adults, but just any patient who wants to have a CGM and just learn a little bit more about like diet and exercise and how it impacts their blood glucose. So it's indicated for adults 18 years and older who are not on insulin. So they're very specific about not having patients who are on insulin have this CGM, or patients who are at risk of hypoglycemia. So this would be best for patients who may just be on oral medications for type 2 diabetes. So again, probably not a patient on a sulfonylurea because that has a high risk of hypoglycemia, but maybe a patient that's on like metformin and a GLP-1 that has a very low risk of hypoglycemia. It also can be used for patients who don't have diabetes. So maybe it's a patient with pre-diabetes and you're really talking to them about diet and trying to move their body a little bit more. Or maybe they just don't even have diabetes at all, but they want to learn more about some of their food choices and look at impact of diet and exercise on their blood sugar. So this was just approved in March, and it should be available for online purchase, which could be a barrier, which will be a barrier. I know for patients, summer of 2024. And it's specifically, if you go to the Stello website, it tells you where you can order this starting in summer of July of 2024. The price is unknown, but they do state that it's similar to Dexcom G7, and that's because Stelo is made by Dexcom. The price of a Dexcom G7 sensor, just one sensor, which lasts for 10 days, is around $130. So I think price for an over-the-counter CGM will be a barrier. They do have, patient assistance programs, but there's not a lot of information on that. As we know, a lot of our adults aren't able to participate in those, but since it's over the counter, maybe they would be able to get like a discount card if they really wanted to use Stelo. Just like the other CGMs, it's worn on the back of the arm. It transmits data to either a phone app or a device, and the data is transmitted every 15 minutes. Stelo, the sensor, is replaced every 15 days. So this is the longest CGM sensor that we have available. We'll talk about our other two CGMs, but I think it's very interesting. They were very open about studies that found that some of the, over 20% of the sensors don't make it until 15 days. So it may need to be changed sooner. And then 10% of sensors last less than 12 days. So, for $130, if I'm paying for a 15-day sensor, I want to make sure it lasts 15 days because that's $260 a month if a patient wants to see a month of data. So just something to keep in mind with this product. It's definitely not perfect. Okay, so let's go a little bit more into our CGMs because we are seeing a lot of these in our older adults because of changes with Medicare last April. I think it was right after we did our grand rounds last year. These are the two newest CGMs that we have on the market. So Dexcom G7 and Freestyle Libre 3. And you can see a picture of both of the devices. So Dexcom G7 is a bit more bulky. So Sunny and I actually wore the G7 sensors whenever we were learning about CGMs and we were going to be educating patients. And it is bulky, like it gets caught on like your shirt. You kind of forget it's there when you're taking showers and it could potentially, come off pretty easily. We've had patients who, when they take their seatbelt off, depending on which arm they have it on, it comes off. So it does stick out from the arm quite a bit versus the Libre is more flat. And there's not as many issues with that device coming off. You can see some other differences that I just want to point out. So the sensor life, the G7 has to be changed every 10 days versus the Freestyle Libre is 14 days. And then there's some changes in terms of like how often the glucose readings are transmitted. That's not too important because they get this data continuously. But one thing that I do want to point out is between the Dexcom and the Freestyle Libre is the data storage. So if you think about a lot of patients that you may care for and definitely ones that we take care of with diabetes, they live with a family member or a caregiver, and we've had patients, their caregivers say, okay, I'll download this, Dexcom app on my phone because I work from home. We're in the same house all day. And then let's say they take a trip. So they're gone over the weekend and they have that app on their phone. That leaves the patient without getting notifications while that, caregiver or maybe son or daughter is out of the house. So they're not getting alarms if their blood sugar is low or if it's high. And even if it is like we want our caregivers to go on weekend trips, but when they come back, there's a big difference in the Dexcom G7 and Freestyle Libre 3 and the data that you can see. So Dexcom G7 only stores 1 day of data if it's out of range with that sensor versus Freestyle Libre stores 14 days of data. Another big difference is G7, the patient, so all of these sensors with Medicare receive a receiver, which looks very similar to a glucometer. So with the G7, you can use the receiver and you can use a phone app. So you could have a patient that has the data on their receiver and then a caregiver that has the data on a phone app, which is really beneficial. And so when we first started, recommending CGMs, or when we were evaluating patients for CGMs, we were recommending G7. But based on a little bit of the data that we're going to go into next, I now changed that recommendation. But the main reason was because of this shared data that you could get. The patient could have the receiver, and a family member or caregiver could have it on the phone app. With Libre 3, you have to choose either or, so you cannot have it on both. And that's really difficult because if you have a family member who wants it on their phone app, then that means that the patient is not getting that data. They're not hearing those alarm bells. So it's just really not beneficial for that patient who it may be beneficial that they see, oh, I ate cake and wow, my blood sugar is 350 right now. So we do have a lot of our patients who use the reader with the Freestyle Libre 3, and they can get that real-time data. But the caveat with that is it's hard for us to receive that data because the reader has to be plugged into a computer in order to share and transmit the information to us. As people who are adjusting their medications, and with providers who, want to see, okay, is this medication or is this regimen that you're on causing nocturnal hypoglycemia? The last thing that I want to touch on is the MARD, so the mean absolute relative difference. So the lower the number, the more accurate the blood glucoses are. And so this was checked with the CGM versus just the standard point of care testing. And you can see that Dexcom G7 appears to be less accurate than the Freestyle Libre 3. And there's studies to back this up. So this was a study that was published this year. 55 adults with diabetes. They wore the Dexcom G7 on one arm, and they wore the Freestyle Libre 3 on the other arm, and then they had blood draws completed. And what they found overall is that there was a lower MARD, which means more accurate, with the Freestyle Libre 3 when compared to the Dexcom G7. And so you can see in this study, the MARD for Freestyle Libre 3 was 8.9% versus the Dexcom G7, which is 13.6%. More alarming whenever I was looking at kind of the specifics, and they broke down the accuracy based on blood sugar levels. Dexcom G7, if patients had a blood sugar less than 70, which is when, we're definitely concerned, we know that adjustments need to be made. The Dexcom G7 was only 66% accurate versus the Freestyle Libre 3, which was 89% accurate. And so, for me, that data was really alarming. So it may not be picking up hypoglycemia that it should be picking up. Whenever blood sugars were within 70 and higher with the Freestyle Libre 3, the accuracy was above 90% for all of those ranges. It wasn't until blood sugar was greater than 250 that Dexcom reached 90% accuracy. So just based on this data, and we've had a lot of patients where we've put the G7 on them, and we're recommending that they come in for point of care testing because they feel low, they're checking, and there's discrepancies in their blood sugar. So their glucometer says 130, or their CGM says 130, but their glucometer says 90. And so that, they're calling, hey, what is this? Like, this seems to be a very wide range. Whenever these were created, it was, known that it could be off by about 20 milligrams per deciliter. And so, but I think we're seeing with specifically the G7, much larger glucose ranges. And just to put it into perspective with like the glucometers and what their MARDs are, so just like a regular like Accu-Check Aviva, there was a study, a review completed in 2017, and they ranged with their MARDs anywhere from 6% to 20%. So it seems like it's a pretty wide range, but a good MARD is like anything like the best MARD is 5% or less. So we're not there with anything right now. Okay, so Medicare coverage of CGMs, one of the reasons that we've seen more CGMs is because of changes last April. Patients, if they're insulin treated, they qualify for a CGM, or patients who have a history, so the patient who may not be on insulin but has problematic hypoglycemia, and I have those criteria listed there, so they would qualify for a CGM as well. One thing just to keep in mind is that if you have a patient who has a CGM, those orders are good for 6 months. And then they need documentation or they need a visit within 6 months again that is related to diabetes so that they can continue their CGM order. Okay, so when can CGMs be helpful? Um, so I was really excited about CGMs just to help us with our diabetes management in seniors clinic. And I think, you know, just like that picture of the balloons bursting, that's kind of how I feel with CGMs. It's really hard to find the right patient where it's beneficial for both parties. So beneficial for the patient as well as for the provider taking care of them. And I find that if the patient is extremely tech savvy, so that means they are like, yeah, I use an app for like turning my lights on in the house, like an app for everything. That's a great patient for a CGM because they will be able to, you know, pair their phone app to connect it with our clinic so that we can receive that data too. We do have a few patients who live with a family member and their, you know, family member is really tech savvy and they plug in the cord to the receiver and they upload the data to us each week. But I would say like we have 3 or 4 patients that actually meet that criteria. So it's been really hard finding those patients who either the patient just gets frustrated with this with the CGM, maybe they don't fully understand the alarms and the bells and the whistles, and they come into clinic and just say, I'm done with this. I don't want to use this anymore. Or the sensor falls off because they forget it's there when they're changing clothes. It really is, it's really hard to find that patient that it's perfect for their use. I will also say, and this literally happened yesterday, and I was like, I'm so glad I received this call today because I want to bring this up. We have a few patients that glucometers are great because it just measures their blood sugar during one time, you know, that one time that they're checking it. And your patients who see a reading above 200 and think, oh, I need to adjust my insulin. Like, I don't like my readings being here. That would not be a good patient for a CGM. So I had a patient call in that we manage diabetes. My pharmacist said that I need to get a CGM. And I looked through our notes and we've repeatedly discussed with this patient, do not adjust your insulin. And the patient continues to adjust their insulin each week when we call them, despite us talking about the risk of adjusting insulin. And so this is a patient where I'm like, you do not need a CGM because you will give yourself an extra dose of insulin if you see that reading increase despite our education. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing, if a patient's unable to use a glucometer, they're not going to be able to work a CGM. So that's a good, you know, I think that's a good way to kind of rule out patients. If they're not able to, you know, click the 1 or 2 buttons on their glucometer, then a CGM is probably not going to work either. Lastly, clinical pearl related to CGMs, vitamin C doses of greater than 500 can falsely elevate glucose readings on the sensor. And so this is important when we're thinking about patients that we may be worried about hypoglycemia. And if they're taking vitamin C, we have a lot of patients that take 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C. And so their sensor may show 130, but they may, it can affect results up to 55%. With doses greater than 500. And so that person could be having hypoglycemia, but we don't know because of that vitamin C dose. So that's something that we screen for as well. Other quick updates, and I'll invite Sunny to come back up for questions. So these were just some other approvals that we weren't able to touch on, but literally I almost changed the medication to discuss this new resistant hypertension treatment. But it was just approved like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So new medication on the market. There's a biosimilar to Prolia now approved. I spoke on tirzepatide last year, and so now there's the chronic weight management, Zepbound, that's approved. And then we have 2 SGLT2 inhibitors on the market as well, new. So we'll take questions at this time.
Thanks so much there, no questions on chat, questions in the room? We probably can take 1 or 2. Kate?
I'm curious your thoughts on the homozygote ApoE patients and why, honestly, that they're approved for the MABs, and if that may be an exclusion in the future. Like, I know there's risk benefit discussion, et cetera, with those patients, but it's just interesting to me that they're even approved given the risks.
Yeah, so that's a great question. When these drugs were first studied, you know, in theory, you want to give these drugs to the patients with the highest risk. So those, we've known for a long time that patients who have the ApoE4, they're carrying 2 of those and not a ApoE2 or ApoE3, that they are at the highest risk and the most likely to develop dementia from mild cognitive impairment on. So when you think about the benefit, that might be a higher benefit group. And so I think it's tough because originally, we didn't know that those patients were going to be higher risk of adverse events. And so it became apparent with aducanumab, and I mean, there were even previous drugs, but it became apparent with aducanumab that those patients were at higher risk of ARIA. And that's when the FDA decided with lecanemab, and they added aducanumab to the black box warning, that those patients are at higher risk. But I think with dementia, it's so tough to ethically say, like, you can't get this. You're at high risk of developing dementia, higher than everyone else, but we're not giving you this drug because of the risk of side effects. So the VA did decide that. The VA was like, nope, we're not going to go there. And I think that might be the case at UC Health too. I can't remember where we ended up landing, but in reality, if the patient understands the risks, and it's not 100% of patients, it's still in the, it might be like 30 or 40% would have ARIA side effects compared to the ApoE3 or ApoE2 folks, or maybe just even heterozygotes, ApoE4. So it's not even 50%. So given that, I think patients can make that educated decision, and that's why we need genetic counselors for it. And I always try to envision myself, if this was me as the patient and I had early onset dementia, would I want to risk it? I might, but also there's risk of death, and you're functioning with mild cognitive impairment. Those people are functioning. They're probably still working, perhaps. So you're also, you're thinking about like those really bad outcomes. Good, bad, I mean, it's tough.
Moreau.
I missed the first 15 minutes, so maybe discuss this, but so are there sex differences then in the response to the treatment, particularly given that the risk is greater in women with the ApoE genotype?
That's a great question. Are there sex differences? I have not seen any outcomes that showed sex differences yet. The studies are pretty small. The clinical studies are 1,700, 1,600 patients. And it's about 50-50 mix, maybe a little bit more women in one study versus men in another study. But that's a great question. I have not seen any treatment difference based on sex so far.
Thanks. Great discussion. Have a great day.
Thank you.